The grand ballroom of the Beaumont estate was a cathedral of light and sound, but the atmosphere within the study was as cold as a mountain grave. Margaret Beaumont stood behind a mahogany desk that had belonged to the family for 4 generations. Across from her sat the daughter, Evelyn, a woman whose hands bore the subtle calluses of a life spent managing the actual operations of the estate. Beside Margaret stood Julian, the younger brother, a man whose primary contribution to the family lineage was the expensive scent of his cologne and a string of failed social ventures. Margaret picked up a silver letter opener, turning it over in her hands. The announcement had been prepared months in advance. The Thorne-Beaumont Trust was no longer a matter of shared labor. Margaret stated that the estate, the accounts, and the ancestral home would pass entirely to Julian. The reasoning was delivered with a chilling lack of emotion. Margaret argued that Evelyn possessed a natural resilience and a cold intellect that made inheritance unnecessary. Julian, according to the mother, required the protection of the family's wealth because his spirit was too delicate for the rigors of the modern world. Evelyn did not respond with tears. The silence that followed the announcement was heavy and absolute. The daughter asked about the 12 years of labor spent balancing the accounts that Julian had repeatedly drained. Margaret's answer was a dismissal. Stewardship, the mother said, was its own reward. The ability to work was a gift Evelyn already possessed, while Julian needed the gift of security. The decision was finalized with a signature on a document that effectively erased Evelyn from the family's future. The daughter was given 24 hours to remove her personal belongings from the house she had kept from bankruptcy 3 times in the last decade. The departure was as quiet as the arrival of a winter frost. Evelyn left the estate with a single trunk and a professional network that no one in the Beaumont family bothered to understand. The name Beaumont was discarded. A new name was adopted: Evelyn Vance. The world of corporate reconstruction and distressed asset acquisition became the new landscape. While the mother and the brother celebrated their newfound freedom at the estate, the daughter was learning the anatomy of a failing empire. For the next 12 years, the Beaumont estate became a series of social media posts. Julian's life was a parade of luxury cars, failed investments in lifestyle brands, and gala events that cost more than the estate's annual agricultural yield. Margaret remained the blind architect of this decline, approving every loan and signing every refinance agreement that Julian placed in front of her. The mother believed that wealth was a permanent state of being, a reward for their status, rather than a result of the careful accounting the daughter had once provided. In the city, Evelyn Vance built a firm known as Vance Acquisitions. The specialty of the firm was simple: identify arrogance. Evelyn looked for families and businesses that believed they were too big to fail. She bought the debt that others ignored. She moved in the shadows of high finance, a ghost in a tailored suit. By the 10th year, the folder on the Beaumont estate was the thickest on the desk. Every late payment, every leveraged mortgage, and every lien placed on the ancestral home by Julian's creditors was tracked with surgical precision. The collapse began with a whisper in the banking sector. Julian Beaumont had attempted to leverage the estate for a 4th time to fund an elite perfume line that had no market. The bank refused. The creditors began to circle like sharks in dark water. The mother, now elderly and increasingly confused by the legal jargon, turned to Julian for answers. Julian's only answer was to flee. He left for a country with no extradition treaty, taking the last of the liquid accounts and leaving Margaret Thorne-Beaumont with a 30-day eviction notice and a mountain of litigation. Margaret Beaumont remained in the master suite, surrounded by the furniture of her ancestors, refusing to believe that the law applied to a woman of her standing. The bank moved to auction the property. The anonymous investor appeared 48 hours before the public sale. This investor, operating through a series of offshore trusts, purchased the entirety of the Beaumont debt. The mortgage, the liens, and even the personal notes signed by Margaret were now held by a single entity, Vance Holdings. An offer was extended to the mother. The investor would settle all outstanding legal issues and provide a modest life tenancy agreement for a small cottage on the edge of the property. In exchange, Margaret was required to sign a total surrender of rights and a confession of financial mismanagement. Desperate and abandoned by the Golden Son, Margaret agreed. The signing was to take place in the very study where the disinheritance had occurred 12 years prior. The day of the meeting was overcast. Margaret sat in the study, her hands trembling as she looked at the empty chair where her husband used to sit. She waited for the savior who had rescued her from the street. When the door opened, the sound of heels on the hardwood was the only noise in the house. Evelyn Vance entered. She was not the tired, overworked daughter who had left a decade ago. She was a woman of iron and silk. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked at the woman who now owned the roof over her head. The realization of the power shift was visible in the mother's eyes, a transition from shock to shame, and finally to a desperate, clawing hope. The mother spoke of family, of darling Evelyn, and of the misunderstanding that had occurred years ago. Evelyn did not react. The folder was placed on the desk. The terms were absolute. The stewardship that Margaret had once claimed was its own reward was now the only thing Margaret had left to offer. Evelyn Vance detailed the new reality of the Beaumont estate. The grand house would no longer serve as a residence. It was being converted into the regional headquarters for Vance Acquisitions. The ballroom would house servers. The dining room would become a boardroom. Margaret was informed that her life tenancy in the cottage was contingent on labor. The delicate spirit of the Beaumont name was dead. The mother was now a tenant, and the tenant was expected to maintain the gardens she had once looked at only from a distance. The daughter explained the logic of the acquisition. Margaret had once argued that Evelyn was too strong to need help. Evelyn had taken that assessment to its logical conclusion. Strength had been built. Power had been seized. The mother's vanity had been the weapon used against her. Julian's failure was not an accident. It was a predictable outcome of the environment Margaret had created. The debt was not just financial, it was moral, and the interest had been compounding for 12 years. Margaret's attempts to appeal to a daughter's love were met with the same clinical detachment Margaret had shown in the past. Evelyn pointed out that love was a transaction Margaret had closed long ago. What remained was a contract. The mother was given a choice: sign the surrender and move to the cottage, or face the street. The bank's bailiffs were already at the gates. The performance of the Beaumont status was over. The signature was placed on the document. Margaret's hand shook so violently that the ink smeared, a permanent stain on the record of her surrender. As Evelyn took the folder, the younger brother, Julian, was mentioned. Evelyn informed the mother that Julian's location was known. His debts in the foreign country had also been purchased by Vance Holdings. He was not free. He was simply on a longer leash, working as a junior clerk in a subsidiary office under a name he didn't recognize. The family was reunited, not by blood, but by a balance sheet that finally reached zero. The transformation of the estate began the following morning. The furniture that Margaret had prized was catalogued and sold. The portraits of ancestors who had built the wealth were moved to the basement. Evelyn Vance watched from the terrace as the mother moved her belongings into the small cottage. It was a functional space, lacking the lavender scent and the silk curtains of the mansion. It was a space defined by necessity, the same necessity Evelyn had faced when she was cast out. The local community whispered about the Vance takeover. The story of the daughter's return was a source of both terror and fascination for the other old families in the valley. They saw in Evelyn a mirror of their own potential downfalls. They realized that the black sheep they had ignored was the only one among them who truly understood how to survive in a world that didn't care about lineage. Evelyn Vance did not attend their parties. She did not seek their approval. She simply managed her assets. Margaret's life in the cottage was a series of lessons in reality. For the first time, the mother had to understand the cost of a kilowatt of electricity and the price of a gallon of water. She spent her afternoons weeding the rose bushes that had once been the backdrop of her tea parties. When Evelyn walked the grounds, she did not stop to talk. There were no Sunday dinners. There were no reconciliations. There was only the quiet, rhythmic sound of a well-run business and the silent observation of a debt being paid in installments of labor. The narrative of the Beaumont family had concluded, but the legacy of Evelyn Vance was just beginning. The daughter realized that the disinheritance had been the greatest gift Margaret could have given. By removing the safety net of the family name, the mother had forced the daughter to become the very person who would eventually own the mother's world. The cold intellect Margaret had criticized was the very thing that had kept the lights on in the valley. The audit was complete. The accounts were balanced. The final reflection on the nature of inheritance centers on the difference between value and price. Margaret Thorne-Beaumont believed that value was inherent in her name. She believed that Julian was valuable because he was hers. Evelyn Vance understood that value is something earned in the silence of the night, in the precision of an audit, and in the resilience of a spirit that refuses to break. The price of the mother's pride had been the estate itself. The value of the daughter's struggle was the empire she had built. In the final year of her life, Margaret sat on the porch of the cottage, watching the black SUVs drive up the lane to the corporate headquarters. She saw her daughter through the glass of the boardroom window, a silhouette of power and control. The mother finally understood that she hadn't lost her house to a stranger. She had lost it to the person she had trained to be a stranger. The heart of the family had been a fiction, but the strength of the family had been real. It just hadn't belonged to the child Margaret loved. Evelyn Vance never looked back at the cottage with regret. She knew that mercy is a luxury for those who can afford it, and in the world of the Beaumonts, mercy had always been in short supply. She had provided her mother with dignity, safety, and a roof, things Margaret had been willing to take away from Evelyn without a second thought. The daughter had been more than fair. She had been exact. And in the world of high-stakes drama, exactness is the ultimate form of justice. The story ends with the image of a ledger being closed. The Thorne-Beaumont name is a footnote. The Vance name is a headline. The daughter stands on the balcony of the mansion, looking out over the valley. The wind is cold, but she does not feel it. She is at home. Not because she inherited it, but because she bought it twice, once with her labor and once with her success. The performance was over. The truth remained. Payday had finally arrived. The impact of this story on those who hear it is rooted in the universal fear of being undervalued by those who are supposed to protect us. It is a cautionary tale for those who believe that favorites can be sustained forever at the expense of the hardworking. The 40-plus audience recognizes the bitterness of family betrayal, but they also find a deep, cathartic satisfaction in the triumph of competence over entitlement. Evelyn's journey is not a fairy tale. It is a clinical demonstration of the law of the harvest. You reap exactly what you sow, even if you are a mother, even if you are a golden son. Julian Beaumont, from his distant office in a cold city, finally understood the weight of the name Vance. He realized that the sister he had mocked was the one who was now providing his meager salary. He understood that every luxury he had ever consumed had been a loan against a future he didn't own. The stewardship his mother had praised was now his only reality. He was a clerk, not a prince. And the clerk was expected to be at his desk at 8 a.m. sharp. Margaret Thorne-Beaumont died in the cottage, her eyes fixed on the grand house. In her final moments, she didn't call for Julian. She didn't call for the friends who had long ago stopped visiting. She simply looked at the light in Evelyn's office. It was a steady, cold light, burning late into the night. It was the light of a woman who had figured it out. The mother died knowing that the estate was in good hands, the very hands she had tried to empty 12 years before. The estate remains a fortress. The gardens are perfect. The servers hum in the ballroom. And Evelyn Vance continues to look for the next audit, the next arrogant empire, and the next debt to collect. She is the reminder that in the drama of life, the quietest person in the room is often the one who eventually signs the checks. The story of the disinherited daughter is over. The era of the owner has begun. The final words of the narrative are a message to the invisible children everywhere. The ones who are told they are too much or too strong or not enough. The ones who are expected to carry the burden while others enjoy the harvest. The story of Evelyn Vance is a promise that the world is larger than the parlor of a biased mother. It is a promise that logic, hard work, and a refusal to be broken are the most valuable assets a person can possess. When the sun sets over the valley, the shadows of the old Beaumont house stretch long across the fields. But the shadows no longer hold the weight of secrets and shame. They are just shadows. The light inside is electric, efficient, and permanent. The house is no longer a monument to a family's past. It is an engine for a woman's future. The audit of the Thorne-Beaumont legacy is complete. The balance is zero. The debt is satisfied. And the owner is finally at peace.